Nice to hear from Representative Blunt Rochester from the great state of Delaware. As an Israeli, we know the impact that small states can have on the world. Hearing from President Abbas and Prime Minister Olmert reminds me how close we were to reaching a peace agreement and how important it is to continue to work towards this goal.
Yes, especially in the face of the rising skepticism about achieving a two-state solution, it is important to remember that peace is possible, and it's also important to keep an open mind to creative and innovative approaches about how to make a two-state solution a reality. Recently, the idea of confederation between two states has been receiving more attention from those that believe it is more pragmatic or more moral, or both, as a means to achieve the two-state solution. We feel that it is important to take some time here at our national conference to expose a larger audience to this idea. J Street does not adopt a particular approach to achieving two states, and our focus on confederation today is not a shift in our organizational policy. We do recognize that the original approach to the two-state idea was developed over 20 years ago, and that key aspects of the conflict have changed since then. Therefore, we welcome ideas to keep the policy updated and relevant, including fresh thinking that can encourage people to look for the path forward out of conflict and toward resolution. To dive into this discussion, we are joined by leading confederation and policy experts, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, a renowned political scientist and pollster, and Sam Bahour, a leading Palestinian entrepreneur and political analyst.
I think that the Confederation
Thank you so much for being here with us, Sam and Dahlia.
On the one hand,
to start off this discussion, we will begin first by sharing some remarks from two experts affiliated with A Land for All, a movement of Israelis and Palestinians who see confederation as the only feasible path forward. Meron Rapaport, the movement's co-founder, and Dr. Limor Yehuda, a transitional justice scholar. Then we will open our conversation with Sam and Dahlia before bringing in some other voices. Great speakers. So we are back. So once again, I want to introduce our wonderful speakers. We have leading confederation experts, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, a renowned political scientist and pollster, and Sam Bahour, a leading Palestinian entrepreneur and political analyst. Thank you, Dahlia and Sam, for being here with us today.
Thank you for having us.
So, thanks so much. So to start off this discussion, we will begin first by sharing some remarks by two experts affiliated with A Land for All, a movement of Israelis and Palestinians who see Confederation as the only feasible path forward. Meron Rapaport, the movement's co-founder, and Dr. Limor Yehuda, a transitional justice scholar. Then we will open our conversation with Sam and Dahlia before bringing in some other voices.
I think that the Confederation model is more realistic because, on the one hand, it is based on the notion of two states, which is still the most popular among Israelis and Palestinians, and of course accepted by the international community. And on the other hand, it is based on the realities on the ground: settlements, Jerusalem, the Palestinian minority in Israel, refugees, and other issues. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a border dispute. It is a conflict between two peoples living on the same land and seeing the whole of it, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, as their homeland. The separation paradigm has failed so far, and it has brought us a lot of misery. We can see it with the experience with Gaza. Therefore, we think in A Land for All that we must adopt a paradigm of sharing, of even power sharing, between these two independent states, Israel and Palestine, and their citizens.
We need to rethink how we think about peace in general and Israeli-Palestinian peace in particular. And by rethinking peace, I mean seeing peace not only as a goal that is negotiated by high-profile politicians behind closed doors and ingrained in a peace agreement, but rather as something that is similar to building relationships between peoples. So we need, and what I and the Land for All movement advocate for, is a paradigm shift in how we view what Israeli-Palestinian peace is about. And at the core of that new vision for peace, we have the idea of relationships that are built on trust and cooperation, relationships that between equals that respect each other.
Meron and Limor believe in the necessity of a paradigm shift in our approach to achieving peace, a two-state solution, from separation to cooperation and equality. They see the connection of both peoples to the land as the changing realities on the ground as a powerful argument for confederation. Dahlia, let's take a step back. Can you explain to us the basics of what confederation actually is and how the confederation approach to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict addresses the thorny issues of borders, refugees, settlers, and Jerusalem, as well as how it addresses security needs?
Yes, and thank you for hosting this discussion. It's an important opening question because there can be a lot of confusion about terminology. The idea of a confederation itself is fairly simple in principle. It's two sovereign states who agree to a loose, voluntary association in order to manage certain shared interests, even some of their sovereign powers. There's no central government, which would imply a unitary state, such as we know of in the case of the United States or Germany. Those are federations, and that's the biggest important difference. A federation is one state with a central government. A confederation, which we're talking about now, is two equal states in partnership. The confederation approach primarily seeks the right balance between having two separate national identities and the need for self-determination on the one hand, together with the fact that there is a reality of interdependence in a very small land area on the other hand, and it tries to ground that balance in the values of cooperation, flexibility, mobility, and equality. So that's in principle. Let me walk through briefly what this approach would mean if implemented in Israel and the Palestinian territories in Israel and Palestine in practice, which is where things get a little more complicated. The nuances of this program differ depending on who's making the case, but here are the main points that most advocates agree on. two separate states, which includes two different legislatures and two different executive powers. So it's not a unitary state again. The border would be based approximately on the Green Line, but it's a different kind of border. Rather than a hard partition or a kind of barricaded border, it's a porous border that is designed to facilitate movement. And the border regime is developed to focus on individual security threats, which would be different from what we have today, essentially a collective and unequal set of restrictions based on nationality. In that sense, the border regime is more like the Schengen zone, which many of us are familiar with. The other major principle is that people would be allowed to live as permanent residents on the other side, the other state, while remaining citizens in their own state and voting in national elections only in their own state. So Israelis could live under Palestinian sovereignty. Palestinians could live under Israeli sovereignty, provided they are law-abiding. They would enjoy full and equal civil and human rights, but they would vote for national elections only in their country of their identity. Palestinian citizens of Israel, Arabs in Israel, would of course remain citizens. And if I had my way in a policy sense, I would say they could choose to be dual citizens if they wanted to. But this mechanism offers new approaches to two of the most difficult problems. One is the issue of settlers. So instead of a paradigm that depends on sweeping, forced evacuation of all settlers, or the great majority of settlers, they could choose to stay and live under Palestinian sovereignty as permanent residents if they don't wish to leave and if they are law-abiding under Palestinian law. The mechanism of separation of residency and citizenship also opens up a new approach for Palestinian refugees from 1948. It provides a mechanism for return, of course, with the numbers to be agreed and vetted for security reasons. But in that sense, because they vote in national elections in Palestine, they wouldn't be a political threat to Israel, which means we can drop the whole language of a demographic threat. In terms of Jerusalem, the Palestinian state would establish its capital in East Jerusalem. Jerusalem simply becomes the capital of two states, but the city remains open rather than divided, shared and accessible to all with reasonable security measures, and guaranteed representation for the Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem on the municipality so that there is proper representation in planning and urban needs. The two states would cooperate on security issues. Now, this is an important point because, in fact, today there is security cooperation as well, but under conditions of occupation. Now we are talking about security cooperation as equals, as political equals in which both sides have an interest in sharing information and maintaining security. They would create a joint economic zone and cooperate on economic policy, of course, shared agencies for common environmental policies, climate crisis management, resource management, and epidemiological needs, which I think we all appreciate now. So there's many more details we could get into, but that's the basic outline. And I want to just point out that the political mechanisms here share many common features with situations that we know about, such as the European Union. It even has some parallels with Bosnia, in which a hybrid together and apart approach was used to help end the conflict. In fact, both of those situations were a matter of ending conflict and preserving peace, even though they are far from perfect, as we all know. This is complicated, but other countries historically began life as confederations, including Switzerland and Canada. So those are other examples where they moved towards a more unitary state. It's primarily a matter of finding the right dose of separation and cooperation. It's a vision grounded in national self-determination, equality of the two sides, acknowledging interdependence, and finding mechanisms to allow that interdependence to work instead of trying to restructure reality or re-engineer reality into a policy vision that has proved that it can't really be achieved. So there are many more details. The research and policy is ongoing, but I hope this helps to orient our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. This really is an innovative approach to resolving the most difficult core issues. I'd like to turn now to remarks from Dr. Bernie Avishai on why he sees Confederation as an integral part of a two-state solution.
Confederation is not an alternative to the two-state solution. It's actually the only plausible way to make it work, and always was. I mean, I have respect for the attachments of people in Israel to Hebron, and I have respect for the attachments of Palestinians to Haifa. But even if there were no refugees and no settlers, Confederation would still be the only way to have ever made this work, given the scale that we're talking about, given the security challenges that we're talking about, given the shared capital that's anticipated, given the fact that these two states are going to be part of the same urban infrastructure and business ecosystem. Confederation is simply what the two-state solution always needed to be.
Bernie really takes into consideration the already interconnected reality on the ground. In his view, any two-state solution would have to have a high level of cooperation between the two sides. So Sam, you and Bernie wrote a recent New York Times article together on this specific topic. He's a political economist and you're a businessman. Do you see Confederation primarily as an economic union?
Well, economies do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in a paradigm of political economy. That paradigm today is the state of Israel imposing on the Palestinians what they can and cannot do economically. The seismic shift that Confederation offers is that Palestine and Israel would not impose on one another, but rather each take a sovereign decision to work together where it is in their interest to do so, and where it is not, neither side would punish the other. Economic State Relations 101 teaches us that preferred trading partners of states are those that share a border or are in close proximity. So Israel and Palestine would be natural trading partners as soon as the boot of military occupation is removed from our necks. For economic partnership to be serious, whoever is doing the proposing must start by recognizing both Israel and Palestine. Under the former US administration, the one Israel loved, the US stopped recognizing Israel's military occupation and classified illegal Israeli settlements as legal in their books. There is not even a starting point in that US approach. If the Biden administration's Build Back Better slogan applies to our region too, then let's finally recognize the state of Palestine so we can all get to work. Palestine and Israel working together can set a global example of economic partnership and jointly offer economic value on the regional and global levels. Here I do not speak of regional cooperation for the sake of sparking an arms race, but rather cooperation that helps bring this youthful region into the 21st century. Imagine Gaza finally being able to be part of the Mediterranean shore tourism destinations that it naturally should be, instead of remaining the world's open-air prison. Luckily, Palestine and Israel will not be starting from zero. There are bordering sovereign states everywhere, living in peace and harmony. Think states across Europe, which were not always friendly to one another. For sovereign states to be a member of the community of nations, they sign on to a myriad of treaties and conventions and protocols and pacts and the like to regulate a wide range of sectors among them. Israel and Palestine can start there and start today. Let me share an example of what Confederation would economically mean. Telecommunications. This is the sector I relocated from Youngstown, Ohio to help build in Palestine. 27 years later, Palestine's telecom sector is still not free or independent. Israeli firms place their infrastructure in illegal Israeli settlements and are granted Palestinian frequencies from the Israeli Ministry of Communications to provide unlicensed services throughout the occupied territory. Confederation would likely not prohibit those companies from operating, but would require them to be licensed and pay taxes. This is good for the shareholders of those Israeli firms, since their firms would then be lawful and allow Palestinians to manage their own telecom sector. I can go on, but bottom line is that Confederation allows us to not only move forward economically, but move forward with a joint interest to do so together.
about Palestinian sovereignty and independence. How in the Confederation model this addresses these needs?
In the Confederation model, it starts with the concept of sovereignty and independence. Confederation not only addresses the need for Palestinian sovereignty and independence, but also Israeli sovereignty and independence as well. In a way, it will be the final signature on Israel's birth certificate. Sovereignty and independence are the required ingredients for Confederation to even be considered. If we start with the respect for the rules-based global system of governance that we live in, then we realize that many of the issues that are issues today are resolved by default if two states start respecting each other and respecting the rule of law. Confederation does not presuppose that illegal realities are ones that must be forced down any side's throat. Rather, it seeks to cause as little forward-looking damage as possible while clearing the way for a new chapter. Some difficult issues will remain outstanding, and that's where all of our efforts should focus. Once one starts with the fact that two free states, free from military occupation and free from fear, then everyone can take a deep breath and do the hard work required to identify where joint interests exist to put meat on the bones of a confederation agreement. Of utmost importance is that in a confederation model, it is the full right of either state not to cooperate if they feel they don't have an interest in doing so. Over time, however, I cannot imagine two rehabilitated generations of Palestinians and Israelis not desiring to cooperate in more than they choose not to cooperate in. Confederation is pragmatic because it is an implementation of what the entire world has accepted as the only model that can work, two states living side by side. But Confederation goes one step further. It not only seeks for two states to exist next to each other, but for the two states to join forces where possible. Some people tell me, you mean like USA and Canada? And I answer, no, like Palestine and Israel, because I'm convinced we can be the poster child for our own version of cooperation in due time. For me, working together is the natural human instinct, but it can only be materialized if working together means working as equals, as peers, as two state entities, each of whose future is not dependent on the other, but better off by cooperating with the other. Lastly, and maybe most exciting, is Confederation enables a new chapter where both parties can envision a joint future, one that the next generation, not 10 generations from now, can start to enjoy.
Thank you so much, Sam. You do make it really clear that you do not see Confederation as an alternative to a two-state solution, but instead you see it as the best way to achieve a two-state outcome. Dahlia, can you touch on why this approach is relevant today?
Sure. Well, for one thing, it's been relevant in various aspects of it for a long time. I mean, the history of the partition concept goes way back to the pre-state era, but even the partition plan of 1947 involved several items that overlap with what we're discussing here, such as the idea of residency of one group on the other side, a shared economic zone, economic policy. These are not as fundamentally radical concepts, but getting back to the modern era, the modern plans for implementing a two-state solution, the policies developed to make it a reality on the ground were developed about over 20 years ago now. And they came to the most detailed level they had been at during the Camp David negotiations in the summer of 2000 and the processes that followed, again, about 20 years ago. The conditions that made them feasible at the time no longer exist. But as we rethink this, we have to ask, how feasible were they ever? Because 20 years of failure to reach a two-state solution along the policy lines envisioned then should tell us something about the political will, the national realities on both sides, and I have come to believe that it tells us that the two-state solution envisioned as a hard international partition was not sufficiently compelling to the two sides in order to convince them to make the kinds of compromises they would have had to make to reach a hard partition. So what are we left with? We can sit around and parse all the failures of negotiations over those 20 years. We can continue blaming the other side, or we can acknowledge that the problem wasn't just the road to getting there. The problem was also the destination. I think we need a better, more attractive vision that can compel the two sides to make compromises, but those compromises aren't as egregious or sensitive as they were before because we've developed different approaches. Another thing to keep in mind as to why now. The public and the leadership on both sides no longer truly believe the two-state solution as it was once envisioned is viable. The political leadership, certainly on the Israeli side, has declared time and again that it is not committed to it. And the public on both sides, at this point, only a minority on each side, Israelis and Palestinians, believe that it is feasible. As a result, we all know that negotiating along those same lines, negotiating the same plan that was developed 20 years ago is de facto what it would mean is that we'll never get there. It's another way of saying we are pushing off political resolution indefinitely. I think that my conclusion over thinking about this has been that 20 years was called giving the first version of a two-state solution a fair chance. The next political process is going to take years, and that's why I think it's urgent now to begin advancing awareness of these ideas, formulating more detailed policies for implementing them, priming the publics, supporting political leaders who are willing to think about it, in order to set up the conditions for a successful peace process that can actually reach its destination in the future.
Thanks, Dahlia. We also spoke with one of the architects of the Oslo Accords, Dr. Yossi Beilin, and we asked him how his thinking on achieving a peace agreement has evolved over the last 3 decades.
My ideas did not really change. I mean, I believe deeply in a border between us and our neighbors, because I believe that the most important thing for me is Jewish continuity, is Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and you cannot have Israel for long as a Jewish and a democratic state if it becomes a state dominated by a Jewish minority. This can be done in a context of cooperation or in a context of total separation. Total separation is almost impossible in such a small area. What I really regret is the idea of we are here and they are there, because there is no question that we ourselves contributed to the hatred towards the Palestinians, to the need not to see them, to have there a wall or something like this, and okay, we are having our life and they are having their life. And here I believe that the Confederation may contribute to another way of education and to say what we really believe, that we are equal. There is no difference between Israelis and Palestinians. They deserve the same rights. They are having their own narrative about the same piece of land, and they deserve it.
Thank you so much to Sam and Dahlia for being with us today and for your work on this important issue. Confederation and the creative search for new two-state paradigms will continue to be an important part of J Street's work, and we look forward to partnering with all of the experts featured in this discussion to push this conversation forward. Following the conference, we also plan to provide our community with more resources on this topic.